Chapter 5 Pneumatic Magic. Part 1 The Starting Point of Magic. The inception of magic is represented by Eros. This gives rise to the construction of an erotic magic, a form of intersubjective magic, functioning by virtue of the law of pneumatic interaction between individuals. It goes without saying that this interaction, in Ficino's theory, is predetermined by prenatal circumstances of an astrological kind. They play a less important role in the theories of Giordano Bruno. From Ficino to Bruno, the doctrine of erotic magic undergoes transformations analogous to those of the concept of transference from Freud to Lacan. For Freud, transference is a complex phenomenon limited to the relations between analyst and patient. To Lacan, the entire world of mankind is merely a transference function of gigantic proportions in which everyone, in turn, plays the parts of analyst and of patient. In the same way, Eros, to Marsilio Ficino, means the relationship between two individuals, the lover and the beloved. To Giordano Bruno, Eros is the driving power of intersubjective relationships in general, group phenomena included. Another essential transformation undergone by Eros from Ficino to Bruno concerns the role assigned to the manipulator in the production or reduction of erotic relationships. Though aware of the syndrome, amor herios, and its fatal consequences, and of the physician's importance in curing it, Ficino neglects the aspect of the production of Eros, whose causes he considers transcendental. On the other hand, Bruno concerns himself particularly with the possibility of erotic manipulation of the individual and the masses. Ficino describes the phenomenon of hypnosis that occurs spontaneously during the natural manifestation of the emotion of love. Bruno concerns himself particularly with directed hypnosis, active and voluntary, upon an individual or collective subject, hypnosis whose rules of production trace those of spontaneous love. It involves profound awareness and intuition, a close examination of the subject's unconscious or subconscious to extract shameful weaknesses, the means by which the subject may be bound, manipulated, hypnotized, put in a state of manageability. This psychic method is used not only in magic but also in medicine, whose success depends primarily not on the efficacy of remedies but rather on the patient's confidence in the healer. So also is religion a phenomenon of collective hypnosis practiced by a prophet on a group of individuals. The founder of a religion is, in a way, a transcendent instrument, for he does not act in pursuit of egotistical ends. The condition for his success lies in creating an atmosphere in which his collective subject becomes manageable, a subject he renders capable of total self-sacrifice. A religion, once instituted, can endure only by the active control it exercises over the education of individuals, a control that must also be repressive in order to prevent the individual from losing his state of depersonalization or becoming capable of being reprogrammed. The same criterion, of course, applies to the promotion of an individual in the religious hierarchy. From Ficino's love involving two people, representing the starting point of Eros as well as of magic, we now come to phenomena of unheard of complexity. The psychosociology of the couple is transformed in Bruno's thinking into general psychosociology, an interdisciplinary science disconcertingly modern, whose far-reaching implications neither classical psychology nor sociology was capable of envisaging, and whose use value neither could appreciate. For if, in our day, anything has a use value that may even outstrip technology value, it is precisely general psychosociology, the science of the forming of the individual within and according to a pre-existence context. the science of manipulation and of intersubjective relationships. Its importance must not be judged by its still deficient representation in the academic world, which has, by definition, a greater force of inertia than that of any social system in motion. Nevertheless, in existing institutional frameworks, the principles of psychosociology have long been known. The forerunner of this discipline of the present and the future is, most probably, the erotic magic of Giordano Bruno. Part 2. Subjective magic and transitive magic. Everyone knows that magic claims to act not only on individuals endowed with a pneumatic body, but also on the inanimate world and on lower forms of life. There is nothing wrong with this popular idea, but to explain the wide range of magic outside intersubjective relationships, there must be another principle that supports it. The English scholar D.P. Walker has suggested classifying magic into subjective, which works on the subject himself, and transitive, working on the surroundings. What he means by transitive magic should be called instead, as we have done, intersubjective magic. A long quote here. The use of transitive magic aimed at living beings coincides in part with practical psychology. This form of magic purports to monitor and direct the emotions of other people by altering their imagination in a specific and permanent way. These magic techniques show a marked tendency to be founded on sexual drives whose power and special importance were probably recognised, and also because they are indeed more closely linked to the imagination than any other natural appetite. The treatises on witchcraft became almost pornographic, and Bruno, De Vinculis in Genere, made a remarkable attempt to evolve a technique explicitly based on sexual attraction for global emotional control. End quote. In light of the preceding discussion, Walker's schema is revealed to be simplistic. Insofar as it is a form of transitive magic, intersubjective magic differs from other functions by the quality of the object on which it is supposed to act. Indeed, its object is itself a subject whose structure is analogous to that of its performer. This partly applies to animals, they too being endowed with a pneumatic synthesizer, but does not apply at all to plants or to inanimate substances. The principles of subjective and intersubjective magic do not function in the lower realms of nature because these are not capable of producing phantasms and therefore cannot be directly influenced by the imagination of the manipulator. According to Walker's methods of classification, the schema of forms of magic should be relatively uncomplicated. Indeed, subjective magic is a preliminary form of all magic, since it is directed towards changing the individual pneuma in such a way as to render it capable of carrying out magic functions. Besides, subjective magic is itself intersubjective, except that the influences it exerts turn back onto the manipulator himself, he being his own patient in the literal sense of the word. It follows that all magic is essentially transitive, even in the event that it takes place in a closed circle. According to Giordano Bruno, we must then differentiate between actual magic and medicine, a form of spiritual healing that presupposes a subject whose psychosomatic functions are altered, and to differentiate the two from religion, a form of altruistic magic that works on a collective subject. Finally, intersubjective magic could not produce changes in the lower realms unless, through correction of its fundamental principles, those realms could be encompassed in a general theory of magic. In any case, given the lack of phantasmic production in lower forms of life and in inanimate substances, the difference between intersubjective magic and general magic would still exist. These conclusions lead to a classification of forms of magic very different from Walker's. General magic, which is a function essentially transitive, is subdivided into 1. Intersubjective magic, which presupposes an identity or analogy of pneumatic structure between the manipulator and the patient. 2. Extra-subjective magic, whose action is directed towards beings of a lower order, or at least does not stem from pneumatic interaction between two subjects. In turn, intersubjective magic is aware of a special case, that of intrasubjective magic, called subjective by Walker, where the performer is his own patient. Finally, when intersubjective magic is applied to the cure of a deranged psychophysical organism, it is called medicine, whereas if applied to a collective subject propounding a general orientation of existence and special rules of conduct, it becomes identical with religion. In general, magic represents a technique for manipulating nature. For us, the term nature signifies a rigidly determined organisation in which there are, however, margins of chance, especially in complex microsystems such as the atom. The word chance is also employed, fortuitously, to dependent systems, such as that of animal or vegetable species, which reveal a rather broad capacity for adaptation and ecological changes. That has permitted the frequent claim that natural selection is due to chance, which is doubtless valid within a category such as species, but no longer makes sense when applied to the general determinism of nature. In Renaissance thought, the concept of nature is much broader than our own, since it also includes all sorts of non-quantifiable existences, from the gods, heroes, and demons of Neoplatonism, to the rudimentary beings of Paracelsus, which we know nothing about for want of ever having met or observed them. Certainly our concept of nature has been scrupulously expurgated of those entities. On the other hand, nature in the Renaissance was overpopulated with them, and magic prided itself on turning their exceptional qualities to account. In the second place, natural determinism in Renaissance thought did not concede any margin of chance. Everything bore the rigid and implacable stamp of destiny, free will itself being a mere invention of the theologians which must be blindly endorsed. In our day, we believe our encounters and our feelings are due to chance. On the other hand, a man of the Renaissance would show us, horoscope in hand, that they were predetermined by the position of the planets in the zodiac on the day of our birth and day of our encounter. He might even do more, helping our will to realize its secret or public inclinations, when someone finds himself poor while wishing to be rich, to be in love with a person who despises him, to have powerful enemies who destroy his plans, or when the weather is good when it should have rained, or vice versa, he resorts to magic. Now, the performer of magic, who is an expert in natural determinism, also knows that there are gaps in natural determinism, that there are propitious times for his will to produce changes in the events of the universe. The human condition has its limits, which the magician can transcend. For instance, he can move about in time and space without the usual restrictions. He can influence people or meteorological conditions, etc. Is X plotting something against Y? This can be found out. Does X want to do away with Y? It can be done. Does X want news of Y, who is far away? Nothing could be easier. Does X want to be loved by Y? Well, there is nothing to prevent it. Does he wish for rain or for good weather? Done. And so on. Medicine is also a special branch of magic. When natural determinism has struck the psychophysical organism of the patient, the practitioner's will, once the diagnosis is made, can effectively intervene to put things back in order. What are the remedies of magic? One cannot understand them without having studied natural determinism as a whole. 3. The conspiracy of things. The doctrine of macro and microcosmic homology in Western culture has an amazing history. It is rare for a Greek philosopher or a Christian theologian not to have been deeply influenced by it, and Henri de Lubac has shown that it is no more foreign to Western medieval thought than to that of the Renaissance. It goes without saying that it is impossible to retrace all of its vicissitudes here. As early as the period of Hellenism, the doctrine took two forms of relatively equal importance in its latter evolution. Both are found in Renaissance thinkers. It is likely, as Anders Ollerud has shown, that Plato, when establishing the homily between humans and the universe, was inspired by the Hippocratic corpus. However, his theoretical proof for that doctrine as a whole derives from his own theory of ideas. According to this theory, the sensory world has a pre-existent prototype, stable and eternal, the intellectual or noetic world. In turn, the human, who is composed of soul and body, combines these two worlds within himself. His soul is a compendium of the world of ideas. Since the noetic cosmos encloses in its essential matrices all that is made sensory in the lower world, it follows that the reasoning part of the human soul contains no less than the intelligential model of creation. The Platonist postulate does not directly take over the theory of magic, whose principles remain more or less identical from late antiquity to the Renaissance. It is Stoic pneumatics that constitutes the point of departure for all those speculations about practical magic. For the Stoics, the cosmos was conceived as a living organism, endowed with the faculty of reason, able to engender rational microcosms. Animans est igitur mundus composque rationis. The doctrine of universal sympathy was formulated by Zeno of Citium and developed by Cleanthes of Assos and his successor, Chrysippus. Like the model of a man who possesses a hegemonicon or principle, the cardiac synthesizer, the macrocosm is also equipped with a hegemonicon located in the sun, the heart of the world. Quote, "The harmony between human psychology and the psychology of the cosmos is therefore complete. Just as the psychic pneuma animates our whole organism, so also the cosmic pneuma enters even the most remote extremities of this great organism called the world." End quote. Chrysippus, author of 2 books on soothsaying, uses the theory of the continuity of the pneuma to prove prognostic phenomena. The attention paid to this subject by Cicero seems to indicate that the Stoic philosophers practiced the prediction of future events through dreams. During sleep, Cicero informs us, the soul is detached from contact with the body, a contagione corporis, to move about in time, learning things past or to come. To judge from the result, this function performed by dreams differs in no way from that performed by prophets in a state of wakefulness. Nam quae vigilantibus accidunt vetibus, iadem nobus dormientibus. To deliver oracular responses, the vates make use of external stimuli, especially of certain fumes and halitus from the earth, to which may be found the soothsaying pneuma, the spirit of prophecy mentioned by Plutarch of Chaeronea. From soothsaying activity to real magic, there is only one step. When, as soothsaying actually represents the ability to make use of the natural flights of the pneuma, the magic of the papyri of late antiquity is none other than a series of practical methods to attract, nourish, and accumulate or store up the divine spirit. In most cases, the pneuma is contained in a material object made for this purpose or in an animal. With this reservoir of spiritual energy within his grasp, the magician counts either on obtaining either knowledge of the future or on achieving some practical purpose. Credit for having synthesized in an original fashion the Platonic, Aristotelian and Stoic elements that make up the theoretical basis for Renaissance magic is due to Synesius of Cyrene, who, having been a disciple of the Neoplatonist martyr, Hypatia of Alexandria, ended by converting to Christianity and becoming a bishop. For the Stoics, the functional relationship between the cardiac synthesizer, hegemonikon, and the pneuma was clearly determined. The hegemonikon is like a receiving post to which all impressions received by the senses are communicated. On the other hand, the Stoic philosophers also develop a theory of phantasms produced by the hegemonikon. For Chrysippus, the clear representation of the sensory object formed in the cardiac synthesizer is called phantasia cataleptici, or comprehensive representation, and leads naturally to irrational adhesion, synkatasthesis. The main difference between Aristotle and the Stoics consists in the fact that the latter think the pneuma is the soul itself, whereas the former believe it to be only a kind of ethereal intermediary between the soul and the physical body. That is why the Stoics conceive of fantasy, according to Zeno and Cleanthes, as a stamp upon the soul, a typosis in psyche. Later, Epictetus is to state that phantasms are influenced by the state of the pneuma that receives or conceives them. He resorts to a comparison. Quote, "Just as houses at the edge of a body of clear water are reflected in its limpid surface, so also are external objects reflected in our psychic pneuma, with the obvious result that they are influenced by the present state of the pneuma." End quote. In order that the images reflected in the mirror of the pneuma may be precise and faithful to their subject, the pneuma itself must be tranquil and pure. So it is that Epictetus, continuing and developing the moral preoccupation of the Stoics, combines them with the doctrine of spirit. To have a clean pneuma, a well-polished cardiac mirror, becomes the equivalent of being virtuous. Here Stoicism finds itself in a company of the whole Platonic tradition, whose most important practical outcome is to obtain, by a suitable technique, the separation of the soul from the body, so that the former may not be sullied by the latter. Beginning in the 2nd century AD, a technique of this kind is known as theurgy, which primarily designates a purification of the soul for purposes of soothsaying and benefic exalted magic, but also for pursuit of a better posthumous destiny. That is why the theurgic preliminary to any process classified among the practices of spiritual magic will be cleansing one's pneuma, or hegemonikon, or cleansing one's heart. These are the theoretical givens that make it possible to understand a number of mystico-magic oriental techniques that place much importance on the transparency, purity, and brilliance of the seat of the heart, such as Taoism, yoga, Sufism, and hesychasm. Whether or not it is designated by the vocables Hasin, Akasha Hridaya, Kalb, or Cardia, this cardiac space always represents the phantasmic synthesizer whose cleanliness is the condition essential to all manifestation of divinity. While theurgy assumes the place of honour as far as Iamblichus is concerned, Synesius holds the pneumatic synthesizer responsible for soothsaying and magic. The synthesis he achieves in his treatise De Insomniis, its title is sometimes quoted as De Somniis, which means exactly the same thing, translated into Latin by Ficino in 1489, is to be revived in Ficino's theory of magic, expounded in the treatise De Vita Coelitus Comparanda. According to Platonic dogma, the soul contains intellective marks of sensory objects. Knowledge is achieved through comparison. The object is recognized by the soul through the pre-existent information it contains. Now, in order to recognize an object, first it is necessary to perceive it, which can only be done by the synthesizer. It plays the role of a mirror, but a double-faced mirror that reflects both what is above, the eternal prototypes of the soul, and what is below, information from the sensory organs. The synthesizer, of course, is by nature pneumatic. It is formed by the phantasmal spirit, phantastikon pneuma, which is the primary body of the soul in which the visions and images are formed. It resides in the interior of the body and controls the living being as from the summit of a fortress, acropolis. For nature has indeed built it within the surrounding structure of the head. In contradistinction to Stoic tradition, Synesius places the synthesizer not in the heart, but in the head. It is not Galen he means to follow, but Plato himself, from whom he borrowed the metaphor of the fortress, who endowed the head of man microcosm with a much higher value than the heart. We have already seen that Epictetus compared the pneuma to a basin filled with water, a liquid mirror. Plutarch of Chaeronea is the first to speak of a pure mirror, nothing more. For Synesius, this double-faced mirror provides the opportunity for two parallel surfaces to meet on neutral territory. Insofar as it is the intermediary between the intelligential world and the sensory world, this mirror, if perfectly clear, will make it possible for inner judgment to contemplate the world above, epitomized by the reasoning part of the soul, and will give the latter the opportunity to perceive and to judge the sensory objects whose image is transmitted to common sense through the external senses. The pneumatic synthesizer becomes, for Synesius, the preeminent terrain of soothsaying and magic. In order that some result may be obtained, it is essential that the pneuma be pure, that nothing carnal obscure the clarity of the mirror. Soothsaying through dreams, of which we have already heard from Cicero, is justified by virtue of the same principle. The events of the noetic world, which is stable and eternal, that is, not subject to the dimension of time, are reflected in the pure pneuma and form voracious dream images that one can recall when awake. And I know not whether the sense, says Synesius in his praise of the pneumatic synthesizer, quote, is not more saintly than others, for it is because of it that we can communicate with the gods, either through sight, through conversation, or by some other means. It is not to be wondered as if dreams are for some men their most precious treasure, because, for example, if someone sleeps tranquilly and during sleep speaks to the muses and listens to what they have to say, he can, on awakening, become, quite unexpectedly, a very elegant poet. As for me, all of that does not seem mad. End quote. The Archbishop of Ptolemais concludes. But there is much more to it. Since the phantasmic synthesizer affords the possibility of an encounter with a world peopled with divine powers, and since, according to Platonic dogma, this world is homologous to the intelligential world, there is a way of acting upon the synthesizer to invoke numerous presences. This invocation, resulting in the company of gods and demons, can be carried out by using certain substances, forms, and colours to which the higher beings are sensitive. Before becoming aware of his own possibilities, man microcosm finds himself in a universe in which the parties, both low and high, cooperate with each other without his knowledge. At the time he grasps the structure of that cooperation, the correspondences between the visible universe and the invisible prototype, he will be able to make use of them in the service of capturing the unknown presences that lurk on the threshold between the two worlds, the demons and even the most celestial gods. That is the doctrine of the signatures of things, the cosmic homologies which Michel Foucault has brilliantly analysed. And that is also Synesius's definition of magic. Quote, "The parts of this universe that sympathise and cooperate with man must be joined together by some means, and perhaps magic incantations provide such means, for they are not limited to conveying meaning, but they also invoke. He who understands the relationship of the parts of the universe is truly wise. He can derive profit from the higher beings by capturing, by means of sounds, phonas, substances, hylas, and forms, schemata, the presence of those who are far away." End quote. Besides this more sophisticated expression of the relation between humans and the world, Synesius also utilizes traditional Platonic theory, according to which the human intellect contains within itself the forms of all the things that exist. 1,000 years after Synesius, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa is still convinced that the intellect of man microcosm, parvus mundus, is the living inscription of eternal and infinite wisdom. Through the activity of our intellective life, we are able to find within ourselves the object of our search. With regard to Ficino, we find a Platonist doubling as a magician. Quote, "Plato is right in his concept of the world as a machine constructed in such a way that celestial things have on earth a terrestrial state, and likewise that terrestrial things have in the heavens a celestial dignity. In the secret life of the world and in the mind, mens, queen of the world, Regina Mundi, there are celestial things endowed with vital and intellective attributes and with excellence. Moreover, that confirms the principle of magic, which enables men to attract to themselves celestial presences by means of inferior things utilized at opportune moments and corresponding to higher things, per inferiore, superioribus constantinea posse ad homines temporibus opportunis caelestia quoda maro trahi." End quote. It is difficult to state more clearly the fundamental principle of magic, but we are still far from suspecting how complex the study of inferior things proves to be, as well as opportune moments and the many celestial gifts which magic is supposed to deliver. 4. The theory of radiations. Study of the magical papyri of late antiquity would take us outside the scope of this book. Some observations must be made, however. The recent research done on the Papyrus Graecae Magicae, published by Preisendants, of which Hans Dieter Betz has edited the first complete translation into a Western language, reveals that magic represents a very ancient tradition with unitary characteristics. Underground currents beginning in late antiquity reach Byzantium at the time of Michael Psellos, and through Arab channels go west into the 12th century. This indicates an uninterrupted continuity of the methods of practical magic, which goes on perfecting its principles and its instruments, especially in connection with the only exact science of the time, astrology. Renaissance magic, while more sophisticated because imbued with Neoplatonist theosophy and anthroposophy, realizes the debt it owes to its venerable medieval predecessors such as Roger Bacon and Albert the Great. They, in turn, are indebted to Arab magic, of which the two fundamental works must be mentioned, the Picatrix by Pseudo-Madriditi and the treatise De Irradiis by Al-Kindi. Picatrix is the title of the Latin translation, done in 1256 at the court of Alfonso the Wise, King of Castile, of the pseudo-epigraphic works Ghayat al-Hakim fil Sir, or End of the Sages by Means of Magic, attributed to the Andalusian mathematician al-Madriditi, 1004-7. It would be hard to deny the influence of Picatrix on Renaissance magic. It must also be pointed out, however, that this influence is primarily practical and cannot justify the importance given by Ficino or Giordano Bruno to the purely theoretical side of magic. The Picatrix itself, of course, is aware of the distinction between theory, astrology, and practice, the manufacture of talismans. But the authors of books about magic in the Renaissance are not satisfied with so little. They think astrology has an ontological foundation and justification, whose explanation must be sought in Neoplatonism on the one hand, and on the other in the much more incisive works of Al-Kindi. Having stated the general principle of work in magic, which is the faith of the operator, a principle that is repeated incessantly, the Picatrix confines itself to giving advice for the making of talismans based on the position of planets in the zodiac, and to formulating the text of planetary prayers to be addressed to the personified planets. Interspersed in these lists are commonplaces of a philosophical kind, such as the homology of the macrocosm and the microcosm. Regarding talismans, they are supposed to produce many results, some of which are mentioned in the first two books of the Picatrix, arousing lasting love or union between two people, obtaining the protection of the great or the respective servants, increasing wealth and commerce, bringing good luck to a city, destroying an enemy or a city, preventing construction of a building, releasing a prisoner from his prison, evicting a man from his home, separating friends, causing someone to incur the king's wrath, assuring fishermen of a good catch, putting scorpions to flight, healing wounds, ensuring the financial success of a doctor, increasing harvests and plants, curing many diseases, etc. Ficino's astrological magic derives much from the Picatrix, but the influence is primarily quantitative, not qualitative. The imposing structure of the spiritual magic of the Renaissance is not comparable to the mediocre pile of empirical procedures that make up the Picatrix. However, since it befell the philologists to have the easy task of discovering in Ficino whole passages borrowed from the Picatrix, they were too easily satisfied with a genetic explanation of a very general kind, according to which the Arab treatise translated into Latin would be one of the Florentine Platonists' principal sources. The inadequacy of this kind of Quellenforschung, which seeks exclusively the literal stamp made upon a work by an earlier one, is easy to demonstrate. Let us suppose that there is a scholar who, engaged in emphasizing the artistic influence upon a monument of Christian architecture, and, knowing that it was built on the ruins of an old Mithras temple, should undertake to establish an exhaustive inventory of the stones of the pagan temple used to construct the new basilica. Having stated, for instance, that 60% of the stones of the Christian structure come from the pagan monument, he would have to conclude, according to the principles of Quellenforschung, that the basilica is 60% a Mithraic temple, which the reality would contradict all too quickly, the two buildings having nothing in common except their raw material, a minor factor. As soon as it came to establishing the difference of style and function between the two works, the Quellenforschung would prove entirely unable to serve our purpose, since, by a strange optical illusion, it is incapable of perceiving the two in their unity. Similarly, the large number of passages from the Picatrix that were used almost literally in Ficino's magic are not enough to prove a deep influence of the first over the second. On the other hand, Though Ficino, like Roger Bacon, has high regard for Al-Kindi's treatise on stellar rays, he rarely borrowed literal expressions from it, which should suffice for the Quellenforschung to remove Al-Kindi from the list of Ficino's principal sources. Nevertheless, it is easy to note that Ficino's magic, the science of the occult correspondences in nature, is largely inspired by Al-Kindi's theory of universal radiations. There is, of course, a major difference between the two writers. Ficino, faithful to the Platonic tradition, bestows on Al-Kindi's radiations the generic name of Eros, and it is from this concept that Giordano Bruno develops the erotic magic taken up in the preceding chapter, to which we shall return later. The treatise De Radiis of the famous astrologer and philosopher Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, 873, has come down to us in an anonymous Latin translation of the 12th century. The fundamental idea of this work, only one among the 270 that the historiographer Al-Nadim attributes to its author, is that each star has its own nature, which it communicates to the surrounding world by means of rays. Now, the influence of stellar radiations upon terrestrial objects produces as a function of the mutual aspects that the stars and the objects produce. Besides, prejacent substances receive the qualities of rays in different ways according to their intrinsic properties, which are hereditary. Whence it is apparent, for instance, that the son of a king will have a natural disposition to rule, and the son of a labourer to follow his father's calling. Except for the highly technical vocabulary, there has been no essential difference between Al-Kindi's and any other treatise on astrological magic, including the later Picatrix. But Al-Kindi soon emerges from the narrow framework of this concept. He believes not only the stars emit rays, but also the elements. Quote, "Everything that actually exists in the world of elements emits rays in all directions, which in their own way fill the entire rudimentary world." Unquote. Since the material world in its entirety represents a combination of the four elements, that too is the reason why the rays of the elementary compounds are differentiated from each other, no two of them being alike. According to Al-Kindi, we find ourselves in the midst of an invisible network of rays coming from the stars, as well as from all earthly objects. The entire universe, from the most distant stars to the humblest blade of grass, makes its presence known by its radiations at every point in space, at every moment in time, and its presence, of course, varies according to the intensity and mutual influence of the rays of the universe, so that there cannot be two things truly identical to one another. Besides, the psychic emotions, joy, sorrow, hope, fear, are also transmitted to the surrounding world in the form of invisible radiations, which also mark their changes according to the arrangement of every prejacent substance. A very long quote here. "Man, due to his balanced temperament, resembles the world. Thus he is a microcosm, and that explains why he receives, as does the world, a power to induce, by his own efforts, movements within an equivalent substance, always provided that imagination, intention, and faith be previously formed in the human soul. Indeed, the man who wishes to perform something first imagines the form of the thing he wishes to impress by action in a given manner. Having conceived the image of the thing, after he has judged this thing to be useful or useless, he either wishes to have it or feels contempt for it in his soul. And if he has judged the thing to be worthy of his desire, he longs for accidents to occur, in consequence of which, according to the opinion he has reached, the thing may actually come to pass. Now the passions of the soul are accidents that contribute to produce a momentum, and concerning them we say that human imagination and intelligence gain resemblance to the world so long as the species of worldly things are transmitted into action due to the functioning of the senses. This is because the spiritus imaginarius, the fantasticon pneuma of Synesius, has rays conforming to the world's rays. Thereby, too, they gain the power to move by their own rays, external things, just as the world, both higher and lower, stirs up the rays of things according to various momenta. Besides, when man receives of a material thing through imagination, this thing acquires an actual existence according to the species in the phantasmic spirit, spiritus imaginarius. Also, the spirit emits rays which move external things, just as the thing whose image it is. Therefore, the image conceived in the spirit corresponds in kind with the thing produced in deed on the model of the image through voluntary or natural work, or both simultaneously. This is why there is no cause for surprise if the theme of birth, constellatio, which produces an image in the spirit of man, produces the same image in another subject, since the one does not differ from the other except only in substance. End quote. The preliminary faith of the performers is the condition essential to the success of his magic act. Certainly the first and principal accident necessary to generate a thing through the model of the mental images is the wish of the man who imagines that the thing can be done. Magic manipulation takes place through sound, prayers, incantations, and through gestures. Quote, "There are two kinds of actions by which, when they are carried out properly, a thing conceived in spirit comes true in action, namely verbal expression and the working of the hand. There are indeed certain speeches which, coming from the mouth of a man while expressing imagination, faith, and desire, actualize in the world motions within individual beings. Sounds produced in action emit rays like everything else in action, and through the rays in the world work upon the elements similarly to other individual things. And as there exist innumerable varieties of sound, each sound produced in action has its effect on other elementary things, and this effect differs from the effects of others. Now sounds, as well as grasses and other things, have received from the celestial harmony their own effect, and similarly a quality of effect very different in different things." End quote. All of the foregoing demonstrates that Alkindi was largely inspired by the spiritual magic of Synesius, who recommends the use of sounds, phonai, substances, hyli, and figures, schemata, through which the true wise man, knowledgeable in the relations between the parts of the universe, can exert influences on some subject or object. To revert to the magic of sounds, there are two kinds of magic sounds according to their astrological correspondence. According to the star, the purpose of process, and the position of the sky, or elementary correspondence, these have an influence on the planets and the compounds of elements, like the bodies of plants and animals. Furthermore, for a result to be obtained, there must exist in the manipulator mental application and representation of the form he wishes to see actualized by the emissions of sounds. This magic of sounds is subordinate to a theory of the natural origin of languages. Every sound was formed according to its purpose by the celestial harmony. The meaning of words is not arbitrary, but their intended purpose may not coincide with the meaning that man has attributed to them. Quote, "On the other hand, when in a sound the meaning created by harmony and that created by man coincide, the power of the meaning of the sound is doubled." End quote. We recognize here the origin of later Kabbalistic theories of the natural language, which is Hebrew. Quote, "Since Hebrew, being the language of creation, was the natural language in which the words indicated the essential natures of the things they had first produced and then represented." End quote. Of course, Alkindi's magic of sounds utilizes comprehensible turns of phrase in artificial language, as well as incomprehensible ones which, by being pronounced in natural language increases the effectiveness of the process. What can we obtain through the use of magic sounds? Almost everything. Prognostications, telekinesis, psychosomatic effects on animals and on man, the casting of a spell on a human being that consists in changing the direction of his will, and finally, paradoxical phenomena such as making heavy objects float on water or rise into the air, producing rain, lightning, or other atmospheric effects, extinguishing distant fires, etc. The most effective turns of phrase are optative, since they stem from the heart, which is the centre of man microcosm. With regard to magic shapes and characters, their functional properties and faculties closely resemble those of sounds. Al-Kindi's treatise ends in an extremely interesting theory of sacrifices. The animal is envisaged as a microcosm whose violent death produces a breach in the macrocosm. Through this breach, the will of the manipulator enters, capable of changing circumstances and things. The sacrificial animal is, of course, in harmony with the goal to be attained. We shall have opportunity to recognise the extent of Ficino's debt to Al-Kindi. Suffice it to say here that Al-Kindi's universe, akin to that of modern physics, is composed of two states of energy, the elementary state and the state of radiation. In turn, the elements combine to form aggregates whose radiations will have new properties. Every object in the world is at the centre of a universal transference of radiations, whose field varies according to the position of the object in space and in time, such that there can never be two objects that have perfectly identical behaviour concerning the emanation and reception of rays. The Italian writer Dino Buzzati, feeling that the dying of a mere cockroach crushed inadvertently has consequences of a cosmic order, seems to be completely transposed into the mind and spirit of Al-Kindi, for whom every event, even the most insignificant, has a universal influence, especially intense in the case of violent death. Magic draws from this very principle its possibility for existence, which consists in emitting radiations, the length of whose wave can reach the receiving posts sighted by the performer. The addressees of the message will be forced to react to it according to the intention impressed into the radiation. We must not lose sight of the fact that Al-Kindi's rays are pneumatic in nature, that his magic is a spiritual magic, which is simply a continuation of the magic of Synesius of Cyrene. That means that a human, endowed with a phantasmic synthesizer, can produce mental states and send them out in pneumatic space on the receiving spirit of another individual of the same species. The effectiveness of this intersubjective magic is ensured by the constitution of the human aggregate and by the performer's faith. In our day, when a belief of this kind emerges from religious establishments and reappears in subjects convinced that their own emotions are transitive, that they can act on other individuals or on the physical world, it is generally agreed that such persons suffer from a form of insanity called schizophrenia. According to Pierre Janet's definition, which was used by Carl Gustav Jung and then became a classic one, schizophrenia is characterized by a lowering of the mental level, and consequently by a short circuit between oniric and diurnal existence, the world of our inner phantasms and the real world. If we give credence to Edgard Morin, it is not difficult for this short circuit to be produced, since the human brain, with all its hypercomplexity, has at its disposal no special instrument enabling it to differentiate dreaming from the waking state. Having established the resemblances between magic behaviour and schizophrenic behaviour, Geza Roheim, the Hungarian-born anthropologist, opened the way to the interpretation of magic as institutionalized schizophrenia. To be sure, there is a remote analogy between magic methods and the mental illness called schizophrenia. The two, however, cannot be confused with each other. True, the magician must be convinced of his capacity to transmit his own emotions on another subject or to perform other transitive actions of that kind. but he never ceases to be aware that the phantasmagoria he has produced function exclusively on the terrain belonging to phantasms, namely the human imagination. This seems to be all the more true since there are cases, very rare, in which the performer suffers obvious symptoms of schizophrenia, which differentiates him at once from the mass of other magicians who are completely sane. In a schizophrenic performer of magic, the inner phantasmagoria finally gain the upper hand, like a foreign presence. See later the example of M. Berwick-Wire and his goblins. Now let us remember that Giordano Bruno never ceased to alert the manipulator of phantasms to the dangers involved in his activity, which collectively amounted to the loss of mental health. Thus it seems that the magician must not be regarded as schizophrenic in principle, nor magic as institutionalized schizophrenia. On the contrary, there are analogies between certain types of magic and psychoanalysis itself, whose method permits within limits a comparison with the method of Giordano Bruno's healers. When the dream is envisaged as a phantasmic production stemming from the unconscious, and schizophrenia as a function of confusion between oniric context and sensory content, we no longer need marvel at the correspondence between the phantasms of schizophrenics and the phantasms brought into play by magicians. After all, they have the same provenance, except that in the case of the magician, the phantasms are produced voluntarily and directed by the performance, whereas in the case of the sick person, they appear to him as strange realities. They possess him. Jung's hypothesis of archetypes, which are performative categories of phantasmic production, rests largely on analogies between the fantasies of patients and the mythico-magic repertory of mankind. How are these things looked upon from the point of view of anthropology, which is not directly called upon to give its verdict on the mental health of its subjects? Ecstatic Religion, a book by the Scottish anthropologist Ian M. Lewis, answers this question. Lewis outlines a quite instructive typology of the manipulator of spirits, supernatural entities, coming to the conclusion that there are three classes. A. The participant in ecstatic cults, like the Dionysian in ancient Greece or the Tsar in North Africa, who is involuntarily possessed by spirits. B. The shaman, who, after having been mastered by spirits, becomes in turn their master, a wounded surgeon in T.S. Eliot's phrase. C. The sorcerer, who, mastering spirits by his will, directs them against the passive subject, who will be possessed by them against his will. What are spirits? Are they beings produced by an objective existence, or are they phantasms, productions objectified on the plane of the imagination, stemming from the unconscious? My next chapter, devoted to the demons and demino-magic of the Renaissance, will give many details on this subject. Spirits are phantasms that acquire an autonomous existence through a practice of visualization, resembling first and last the art of memory. However, it is not unusual for them to reveal themselves without being invoked in that way. For example, in the use of hallucinogenic drugs by sorcerers or in mental illnesses. Of course, Lewis is wrong in stating that sorcerers dominate familiar spirits at will, for that is not true of Western sorcery, where the relationship between sorcerers and spirits is more problematic. Likewise, it is difficult to differentiate between shamans and sorcerers, since the latter do not learn how to dominate their spirits until they have revealed themselves spontaneously to them. In other words, we can essentially make a distinction between two classes of individuals who have to do with spirits. One class invokes spirits while inventing them. The other receives them, but can make use of them only after conscious organization. There is no doubt at all that the spirits that make their presence felt stem from the unconscious, but the others, those that are invented, where do they come from? Their source is the same, since their models, transmitted through tradition, have already sprung up in the fantasy of another manipulator. The Renaissance magician or sorcerer learns of their existence through manuals of higher magic, such as the steganography of the abbot Trithemius, although this is only for the most part a treatise or cryptography, or the occult philosophy of his disciple Henricus Cornelius Agrippa, or through manuals about low magic, such as those catalogued in the Antipalus Maleficiorum of the same Trithemius, a very learned occultist. In conclusion, there are only two kinds of manipulators of phantasms: those imbued with unconscious production, having only succeeded with great difficulty in putting it into some kind of order, and those whose activity was entirely conscious, consisting in inventing mnemonical phantasms, which they endowed with autonomous existence. Only manipulators of the first sort are comparable to schizophrenics, except that for better or worse they learn to find a modus vivendi with their unconscious productions. Unconscious productions, elicited in most cases by the use of hallucinogenics. Among them, this is verifiable, there are also genuine schizophrenics, such as M. Berberguier at the beginning of the 19th century, or Dr. Ludwig Staudenmayer at the beginning of the 20th, who utilize magic beliefs and techniques to try to organize their seriously disturbed mental processes. In this case, far from considering magic to be institutionalized schizophrenia, we should, on the contrary, look at it as a remedy, a very potent one, against the devastating invasion of mental illness. Magic is not a factor of disorder. On the contrary, it is a means to re-establish a peaceful coexistence between the conscious and the unconscious. Where this coexistence is under attack, either by mental illness or by the voluntary use of chemical substances with psychedelic effects. The magician is an analyst who can only practice his profession after being analysed himself. But access to the unconscious can be left open to him in two different ways: by invasion, either pathological or brought about by external means, or by assimilation of the tradition. In the second instance, no analogy with schizophrenia is admissible, any more than it would be in the case of anyone who learns anything, including the scientist. These thoughts, which we shall develop later, are a preamble to the account of intersubjective magic from Al-Kindi to Giordano Bruno. The concept of radiation, fundamental to Al-Kindi, is gradually replaced by the concept of Eros. Pneumatic harmony of the universe is the general assumption from Ficino to Bruno, and its instrument is Eros. Through Eros, the universe knows a certain concentus, which is order, harmony, integration, and whose most disturbing formulation is found in one of Ficino's epistles. Quote, "I believe that there is of necessity a law and a certain harmony, concento, and consonance between the world's elements in the humours of animals, in the life of beasts, and even in the societies of brigands, since they could not associate with one another if there were not a certain order in all of that." Unquote. This is far removed from theories of the self-destruction of evil. On the contrary, even in evil there is order, for otherwise outlaws could not stay together. This general harmony, of which Eros is the main instrument, Ficino does not place in as large a framework as that of Al-Kindi. Only Giordano Bruno restores things to their true complexity in his vision of a universe in which each individual and even each object is connected to all others by invisible erotic links. The expression vinculum vinculorum amor est is substituted for an analogous expression that we can ascribe to Al-Kindi without risk of distorting his ideas. Vinculum vinculorum radium est. The bond of bonds is the ray. The energetics of Al-Kindi adds to the psychologism of Bruno, for whom things do not emanate from cold, sterile, and almost inert radiations, but from living rays, coloured by passions, by their very existence, prompting sympathy or antipathy, love or hate. Contrasted to the objective transference of Al-Kindi is the highly subjective transference of Giordano Bruno from universal magic. The concept of intersubjective magic is clarified and takes shape. Part 5. Pneumatic Magic. The spiritual magic of the Renaissance, Marsilio Ficino being its first and most influential representative, is built on the principle of universal pneumatic sympathy. The first corollary of this principle is that man, endowed with a hegemonicon located, generally speaking, in the heart, the organ corresponding to the sun in the cosmos, has the capacity to impart voluntary changes to his own fantasy. These changes, due to the continuity of the pneuma, are transmitted to the objects aimed at by the manipulator. The phenomenon is natural, produced without conscious manipulation on the part of either the sender or the receiver of the pneumatic current, and its starting point is self-consciousness, which is Eros. The latter establishes links between individuals according to the transcendental information that the pneumatic conveyances of their souls have accumulated during their descent through the planetary heavens. As for the magic proper, it represents knowledge permitting the performer to exploit the pneumatic currents that establish occult relations between the world's parts. Now, these relations are regular and can be classified into 7 great planetary series, such that all nature, with its mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms, including the human species, is linked to the 7 wandering heavenly bodies and to the other stars by invisible bonds. The magician has, in the first place, expert knowledge of these bonds. He is able to classify every object in the world according to the appropriate series, and thereby to attract benefits from the star in charge of the particular series. The fact that there are many representatives of Renaissance magic should not hide from the investigator the main lines of its development, which prove to be relatively simple. Its point of departure is Ficino's treatise De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, 1489, which specifically states the following principles. Just as the soul of the world is concentrated in the sun, whence it radiates to all other parts of the universe through the quinta essentia, which is the ether or the pneuma, the human soul is concentrated in the heart and enters the body through the spirit. Things have a varying degree of craving for the quinta essentia, which means that certain things have a pneumatic capacity superior to others. What is the quinta essentia? It is the cosmic spirit, which fulfills the same function of intermediary between the soul and the body of the world, as does the human spirit between the individual soul and body, this source of all generation and growth. We can call either heaven or quinta essentia. Quote, author's note, Platonists here means Arab astrologers and magicians. Through it, the Platonists, by adapting our spirit to the spirit of the world by means of the magic of talismans, ars physica, and emotion, affectum, try to direct our soul and our body toward the blessings of heaven. That causes the strengthening of our spirit by means of the world's spirit, through the action of the stellar rays acting beneficently upon our spirit, which is of the same kind as these rays. This lets it attract to itself celestial things. Unquote. Ficino is a synesius who, insofar as the theory of the vehicle of the soul is concerned, is corrected later by Proclus and Macrobius, and concerning the doctrine of universal correspondences by Alkindi's theory of radiations and by his astrological magic and that of the Picatrix. As we have demonstrated elsewhere, Ficino's spiritual magic does not call for fewer manoeuvres through the intermediary of demons, but demonology properly, so called, was only developed by Trithemius, an enigmatic individual to whom I devote part of an ensuing chapter. A combination of Ficino's magic and Trithemius's demonomagic is to be found in the 3 books of Agrippa's not very original but very influential occult philosophy. Giordano Bruno's magic is inspired in the first place by Ficino, utilising as complementary sources Albert the Great, Trithemius, and Agrippa. With respect to Tommaso Campanella, a dissident Calabrian monk at the beginning of the 17th century, whose political utopia seems to have exerted a decisive influence on a group of German friends who produced the farce, ludibrium, of the Rosicrucians, he too cultivated a pneumatic magic deriving from Ficino with inoffensive rituals that were greatly appreciated by Pope Urban. From Ficino to Campanella, a number of writers know about Ficino's theory of the pneuma without always making use of its magic side. Among them we mention Pico della Mirandola, Francesco Catani da Diaceto, Ludovic Lazzarelli, J. Gohori, Pomponazzi, Francesco Giorgi, Pontus di Tiad, Guy Lefebvre de la Borderi, and others.